Hi everyone, my name is Olivia Kurkowski, and for my Genius Hour project, I have decided to record a podcast episode. Um, the reason that I chose a podcast format is I love listening to podcasts. I listen to several different ones. I have pretty much a podcast that releases every day. And I think that this seemed to be the best format in order for me to convey my thoughts, my opinions, give you some facts about the topic that I chose for this project, and just kind of, delve into a topic that I am very passionate about. The topic for my project that I selected was gender representation of athletes in the media, and how it differs based on the sport that is played, looking at some differences between, international players as well as national players within the United States. And just in general, talking about the relationship between gender and sports in relation to pop culture. And I'm going to kind of also delve into a little bit about why it's important to talk about the differences between gender when it comes to sports and how those differences can have an impact on youth athletes. As someone who, did sports a lot growing up, this is a topic that I have been very passionate about for a while. There's a definitive gap in gender representation when it comes to athletes and sports just in general, which can really have a big impact on people that are young and people that are considering potentially going professional or wanting to continue that sport in high school and college, etc. Like even if they don't want to go pro, if they don't see themselves being represented, that can very much impact whether or not they choose to continue, competing in that sport. And they might be very good at it, they might be very talented, but if they don't have that confidence in themselves that they're able to do the sport that they love, then that is going to have a huge impact on their well-being and their confidence levels. And yeah, so that's just a little bit about, why I chose this topic, why it's important to me. And yeah, so to start off, before I go into the specifics of certain sports, I will be going over some general facts about gender representation as it stands right now and sports just in general, in terms of the amount of media attention that it is given based on gender and just some generalized facts to kind of set the stage for where I'm going to be going with this podcast episode. So to start with, I am a follower of ESPN. I have the app. I go on their website very frequently. I get probably at the minimum 15 to 20 notifications a day from ESPN because I have so many sports that I am interested in. I have so many different interests in the sports field just in general. I follow so many different athletes, different types of athletes, different levels of athletes, etc. But one of the things that I have noticed more as have gotten older is that on ESPN, a lot of the sports that are highlighted are male dominated. So, for example, if you go on the ESPN website right now, the top sports leagues that you will see listed are NFL, MLB, NHL, MLS, NBA, PGA, and UFC. The reason why this is so important is that UFC may be a little bit less than the others, but for the most part, all of those sports leagues that I just listed are all sports leagues that have male athletes. You don't really see the WNBA, the NWSL. You don't really see any type of national softball league, which does exist, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit because there is a big misconception that there is no professional softball league. And if you're a softball athlete, once you graduate from college, your career is kind of done. That is definitely not the case, but that it tends to be the public perception. So, all of this to say, they're the sports that are heavily featured on ESPN's top pages, top stories are all male leagues. This is not unique to ESPN. This is very common across all sports. There tends to be more of a media focus on male sports just in general. And on that same note, women of color don't usually receive media attention unless it's related to the Olympics. This has been a proven fact through a couple of different studies that I have seen in several of my classes, but specifically, Latina and Asian American women are the ones that tend to receive less media attention and less media coverage unless they are in the Olympics and they're in a medal event. And that is only when they get that attention. And not only that, that attention goes away. So even though you might be an amazing athlete and you might have an amazing go at the Olympics, once the Olympic Games are over, that media attention goes away. And then you don't get that media attention again for another 4 years or 3 years, really, until you start potentially, wanting to try to compete to get back on the Olympic team. But even then, that's not a guarantee because some people only compete in one Olympics and then that's it. Just because in the US we do tend to have the same stars at every single Olympic game for the summer or the winter games over the course of, 2 to 3 games minimum. That's not the case for everybody. There's certain, life situations that happen and they cause, athletes to not come back, and if they don't have that media attention outside of the Olympics, they're not going to be very well known in terms of the public. And another thing with women and sports in general when it comes to representation in media, a lot of streaming services are the primary platform for women's sports, primarily, again, besides the Olympics. This will be a recurring theme as you'll see throughout this podcast that, the Olympics tends to be where women's sports get the most recognition and the most type of media attention. However, once those games end, and again, these games only happen every 4 years, technically every two, if you count winter and summer. But besides that, if it's not just this like 2 week competition, you're not being featured heavily on any type of media platform, and that's very discouraging. And it's hard to grow your brand if you're an athlete. So, national broadcasts are only for international competitions, just generally speaking. While this has changed in recent years, it's still not at the point where women's sports are receiving the same attention as male sports when it comes to national TV. So, for example, the NWSL, which is the National Women's Soccer League, does primarily stream on Paramount Plus. They have had a deal with ESPN and CBS in the last couple of years to get more of a national broadcast coverage. However, that tends to only be for playoffs and the final game, the championship game. The regular season matches, for the most part, I am a huge watcher of this league. I will actually be watching a game later today. I have to watch it on Paramount Plus because I can't find it anywhere else. And honestly, it's the only reason I even have Paramount Plus. Another example here, the WNBA primarily streams on ESPN Plus and Max. These streaming services are sometimes the least popular choice for streaming services. They're not streaming these games on Netflix or Hulu. They're streaming them on Paramount Plus, ESPN Plus, and Max. These alternative streaming services that not everybody has a subscription to. And so if you want to watch women's sports, you have to end up subscribing to so many different streaming services just to see a regular season match or a game. And that's very frustrating, especially if you are an athlete in one of those leagues. The Nike Super Bowl ad that was featured this year did start to change the conversation about making women's sports and female athletes in general more visible to a national audience. And it was the first time that Nike had taken such a heavy stance on trying to promote higher media coverage for female athletes. But again, this ad was only featured in February. It's April when I am starting to record this podcast, and less than 2 months later, there's not going to be much of a change. This is going to be an ongoing conversation about how can we get more visibility to increase the amount of media attention and media representation that women have. And lastly, just as a side note, the only sport that is male dominated but doesn't have as much media attention associated with it is NASCAR. That tends to be the only sport where it's not very heavily featured on the front pages of sports websites. There is a tab for it on like ESPN's website and stuff, but again, you're not seeing those headlines. The headlines that you are seeing are usually like NFL, MLB, MLS, NBA, NHL as like your top five. Also, a lot of sports that do tend to have a lot of female athletes, such as lacrosse, rugby, gymnastics, and figure skating, they only receive national attention when it comes to the Olympic Games, like I said before, or also when it comes to NCAA. Like, if you're on the college level, chances are your match will be streamed on a streaming service, or at the very least, there's a live stream somewhere you can watch it. But unless you're competing in the Olympics or unless you are at like a top level of an NCAA Division One school, you're not getting a lot of media attention. Um, and that's just like a little side note about some other sports that maybe should receive more media attention. But, for the sake of this podcast and for the sake of time, I am going to primarily focus on soccer, basketball, tennis, baseball versus softball, and golf when it comes to looking at, the differences between gender representation from the media. And yeah, so that's kind of where I'm going to be taking this podcast. But before I go into that, I'm going to also go into a little bit about youth sports and why this is such a big influence on whether or not youth athletes do continue in their sports. So, moving on to the conversation surrounding youth sports and why a lack of gender representation in the media can have an impact on youth athletes. When young athletes don't see themselves represented in the media, it can be very frustrating because they don't necessarily see themselves being represented. And a lot of people don't want to have that pressure of being the first of their identity to be represented. So, for example, the trans swimmer Leah Thomas, when she came out as transgender, it was kind of one of the first times we had seen a transgender athlete come out, but she faced a lot of backlash for it. And now, with recent executive orders and recent administrative decisions coming out of DC, we see that there is a push to put restrictions on specifically trans athletes. But Leah herself has spoken out about how it felt like that there was an added pressure because she was the first trans athlete at the college level that was being put under this much scrutiny. And so if an athlete doesn't see themselves represented and they want to be that role model and they want to be that person, that comes with a lot of strain on your mental well-being and your emotional well-being because it's a lot of extra pressure. Everything that you do is magnified because you are being looked at as the very first person in your group to do it, and there's a lot of pressure that comes with it. So when young athletes don't see this representation, they might not want to actually pursue a career because they don't want that extra pressure, or they just don't see a way for themselves to break into that sport that they've been playing. We tend to be very understanding. We tend to, we as the society, I'm using and generally speaking, there there tends to be a, how do I put this? A more of a grace when it comes to youth sports, right? Like we tend to be more accepting of various identities when the athlete is young and when the athlete is playing a youth sport and the only thing that you're competing for is potentially the county championship or the state championship, right? Once you get to that national, international competition level, the standards for what is deemed to be acceptable and not acceptable are very different. And I think that's an important thing to consider when we are looking at gender representation and the media and how it represents athletes of various gender identities. Also, role models only exist in sports when the representation is there. So if an athlete doesn't see themselves represented, they don't have someone that they can look up to. There has been, again, a shift towards finding different types of role models, different identities have been starting to, um, be more represented. But again, a lot of people don't want to be that first person. They don't want that pressure of being the first. And there have been some changes, right? Like they have started to incorporate more identities. They have started to increase the amount of gender representation when it comes to athletics. But there is still a huge amount of progress that needs to be made. The Nike ad that I mentioned before, that is an example of a step in the right direction to giving a huge platform like the Super Bowl, an immense amount of media attention. So many people were talking about that ad. And, it came at a point when female sports are starting to be taken more seriously. And I think we're at a point where people want to see women play sports. People want to see different people on the field. They want to see other identities represented. And I think even though there is always going to be some backlash and there's always going to be some pushback when it comes to that, this is kind of a step in the right direction. I think we're going to kind of start to see that, but unfortunately, I don't think it's happening at a quick enough pace to get people that are currently struggling with these frustrations and these, you know, thoughts of, well, I don't see myself out in that field. How can I break into the sport if there's not room for me? And that can be a very discouraging feeling, especially if you feel very passionate about your sport or if you're very talented at your sport. I'm sure there's so many athletes that could have been so successful on the professional stage. They just didn't feel like they could do it because nobody else had done it yet. And that can be a very discouraging and upsetting feeling, especially if you're a youth athlete. So, because of the changes we were starting to make, that's why I kind of wanted to do this podcast as well, because I think that, as I go through some of these sports that I've highlighted, I think that, there has been a lot of progress. So, for example, I'm going to start off with soccer. And in the soccer realm, there has been a lot of progress where maybe in other sports and leagues there haven't been. But that's also been a very, very, very recent change, as in like within the last 2 years or so. And so I think we still need to make change. We still have progress that needs to be made, but again, if we don't have these representations in the media, then youth athletes don't have anyone to look up to. And when you don't have the representation, you might be having leading to someone missing out or not having a chance to compete at that level just because they don't have anyone to look up to. And that's a very, very sad reality to face. So, starting off with the main sports that I will now be going into a comparison between how the media markets both male and female athletes in their respective sports. The first sport that I'm going to be discussing is soccer. And the main reason that I chose soccer to start with is, there's been a lot of changes in recent years when it comes to more female representation and having the media cover women's sports more in general, but specifically with soccer because of the equal pay fight that had come out with the U.S. women's national team suing the U.S. Soccer Federation for not paying them equally as their male counterparts simply because they were women. And with the attention that the team got as a result of their as a result of their 2019 and 2015 World Cup wins respectively, specifically with the 2019 one, you really saw an increase in the viewership rates for the NWSL, which is the National Women's Soccer League. And since then, there has been this continuing increase in viewership, promotions, more celebrities getting involved in partnership deals, in, ownership. So, for example, the New York, New Jersey team, Gotham FC, they have two very strong owners in Eli Manning and Sue Bird, who is married to Megan Rapinoe. So, there is a lot of connections there. But also, Patrick Mahomes and his wife, Brittany, are part time owners of the Kansas City team for the National Women's Soccer League. You've also seen with Los Angeles, you've seen celebrities like Natalie Portman. You've seen, several other big name A-list celebrities, so many accounts to the point of I can't even think of any, but I know Natalie Portman for sure has been a very, very, involved in the face of the team ever since they decided to create a team in Los Angeles. And so, not only are you starting to see a switch in the viewership rates when it comes down to, you know, just the general population, but you're also starting to see a switch with celebrities and professional athletes getting involved in the women's side of the game, not just the men's side, to really try to grow it as much as possible. And for that reason, it's considered to be the fastest growing sport right now in the United States. So, the way that I'm going to kind of go through this is I'm going to compare the two leagues that exist currently in the US in terms of media representation. And then I'm going to kind of dive a little bit into international soccer as well, because as I have said in the beginning part of this podcast, unless sports and female athletes are on the global stage, such as the World Cup, for example, or the Olympics, they don't get a lot of other attention. And so I kind of wanted to go nationally first, but then expand it to the international scale as well. So starting off with soccer, in the U.S. we have MLS, which is Major League Soccer. There are currently 30 teams total, 27 play in the U.S., 3 play in Canada. They were founded in 1993 after winning a bid to host the 1994 World Cup, which is really when you started to see soccer take off on the United States front, as well as just North America in general. A lot of the teams that are in the MLS, they are in cities that are similar to other sports. Like they share a lot of big sports cities, such as, New York, Philadelphia, Orlando, Miami, these big name cities where you have a lot of other leagues as well, such as the NFL, the MLB, the NHL, etc. Um, Currently, the most followed team on social media platforms is Inter Miami FC, but that was only after the Messi trade. Um, Total followers across all social media platforms for all teams in the MLS equates to around 50 million people. The league account itself has grown over 20% on all platforms since Lionel Messi joined. So, when Lionel Messi decided to take his talents to the United States, it was a really, really big deal because a lot of people weren't sure exactly why he would pick a United States team when he had some of the best teams in Europe and even in Asia. wanting him to play. And he's considered to be one of the greatest players of all time, up there with Cristiano Ronaldo, which I'll get into the two of them when I go to the international side of soccer. But after he joined the league, there was a big resurgence in the amount of people that were giving this sport attention because all of a sudden, this international star was right in your backyard if you lived in Miami. And so, because of that, there has been a huge increase in publicity for the league just simply because he decided to join it. So, currently, the most followed players in the MLS are Rike Pieg, who has 7.6 million followers across all of his platforms. Hector Herrera, who has 1 million followers on Instagram. Christian Benteke, who has 653,000 followers on Instagram. And the most followed MLS player, as you can assume, is Lionel Messi with 505 million followers on Instagram, which is a considerable amount higher than everybody else. So these players have been very dominant in their stats. So Pieg led in passing this last season, and he scored 13 goals. Messi was third in goals scored at 20 and attacking. Herrera did not have a high stat season, but did have a top 15 finish in passes. And Benteke dominated in attacking with 23 goals and starting in every game that he played. So those are just some names that, have a high following or have a lot of high stats across the league. And when it comes to the media representation, the games for the MLS can be found on national TV broadcasts most of the time. They do have a deal with Apple TV to have an increased access via streaming for fans at home, especially if, for example, you don't have access to a national TV broadcast, because I know a lot of people nowadays have kind of just switched over to streaming services rather than cable TV. Um, and like I said before, the social media attention with this really did skyrocket once Messi joined Miami. Unfortunately, with this league, though, there's a big focus on big name players on the international stage, but they don't really expand to other players who are up and coming and are popular nationally. And so, because of this, there is, even though as a whole men get a lot more attention and a lot more media attention than women do in the sporting world, with MLS specifically, there is more of an effort and more of a push to try to give them more representation for those younger players because right now they're not maybe the most popular player, but they could develop into an amazing player on the international stage. They just need to be given that platform to showcase what they can do. And, unfortunately, like I said, this is not just a gender based issue. This is something that we see across the board. If you have a big name internationally, obviously you're going to want to promote it. If you're Inter Miami, you're obviously going to want Messi to be your leading person rather than some random teenager that just joined and didn't even, you know, have any other international experience, because the people that people know, the international icons, are the names that are going to bring in that money. And that's why they have the deals that they have in place. So moving on to the NWSL, which is the National Women's Soccer League. Compared to the MLS, it is a lot smaller, but it is definitely growing. They do currently only have 14 teams, all playing in the US, but that is set to expand across the next couple of years to eventually be 16. And the goal is to try to get up to that number 30 to match the MLS. But currently, they are still expanding. This league was established in 2012 as a successor to the WPS, which was Women's Professional Soccer. It is the longest women's professional league in history because all other professional soccer leagues have not been as successful. Four of the original eight teams were part of the WPS. So when the NWSL was established, you had the Boston Breakers, the Chicago Red Stars, Sky Blue FC, and Western New York Flash, and all of those continued over and created this new league with four other teams. And original rosters included up to three women's national team players for the US, two Mexican national team players, and two Canadian national team players. That way you had kind of all of a representation for North America. So you do see a bunch of international players in the NWSL nowadays, but when the league was first formed, it was predominantly from the US, Mexico, and Canada, and every team could only restrict the amount of people they had on it to three women's national team players for the US, two for Mexico, and two for Canada. Um, like I said, it's going to continue to expand. It will have 16 teams by 2026, with hopes of more eventually joining. Their total followers across all social media platforms equate to 2.41 million. The league account itself has about 700,000 followers on Instagram. So some of the big names in this league, we have Sophia Wilson, who is formerly known as Sophia Smith. She did get married this past year. She currently has 461,000 followers on Instagram. Then we also have Mallory Swanson, who is formerly known as Mallory Pugh. She currently has 688,000 followers on Instagram. Trinity Rodman, the daughter of Dennis Rodman, has 536,000 followers, and the Brazilian superstar Marta has 2.8 million. With these four players, they have really been some of the biggest faces of this franchise these last couple of years. Mallory Swanson, unfortunately, I think about 2 years ago now, had a massive ACL injury. And so as a result of that, she did kind of lose some of her stats and she had a long recovery back, and currently Sophia Wilson is pregnant, so she's not playing in this current season that is ongoing. But besides that, these four people have kind of really been the faces for this league for the last couple of years. Last season, Smith Wilson had 12 goals and a 72% passing rate, which beats Benteke from the MLS. She had a higher passing rate and a higher amount of goals. Um, Swanson had 7 goals and a 74% passing rate, which was less goals than Sophia Smith, but she did play longer and she had more national team time compared to Swanson, since she was working back from the ACL injury. Rodman had 8 goals and 66% passing rate, and Marta had 11 goals and the highest passing rate of the league at 82%. So when it comes to the media attention that this league receives, most of the coverage is on the US women's national team star players as well as some other international players. But there has been a shift in this recently, especially because there has been an increase, like I said, in visibility across the league. And so as a result of that, they are starting to give more of a platform to other people who, were drafted out of college, or some people gave up college to go pro earlier. And so as a result, they are getting more media coverage now. So whereas the MLS is still heavily focusing on the international players, the NWSL is trying to give more of a platform to the people that don't really have a name for themselves just yet. As I said earlier, their games predominantly stream on Paramount Plus. It is kind of hard to find their games on cable TV outside of the final or the championship game. ESPN and CBS are trying to up the airtime, but they have been met with pushback from their execs, mostly because they don't see yet the investment that would go along with having women's sports, specifically women's soccer, even though, like I said, it is the fastest growing league on the women's side for the United States. But there's still a big pushback from the higher ups that they're not exactly sure if this is going to actually sell. And there is a lack of coverage in general on the national level. More of the coverage tends to be local, regional, or related to U.S. women's national team news in terms of where the cable TV broadcasts are happening. So even though I am a supporter of Gotham FC, which is the New Jersey, New York side team, they have had a couple of games that have streamed on ESPN and CBS across like the last couple of years, but I also get a lot of access to those games because we do live in New Jersey. And so as a result of that, they do play in North Jersey. That is where their stadium is located. And so that is why we get a lot of their games broadcasted on national TV. If you were to go to Colorado, for example, you're probably not going to get any type of broadcast because there's no national team currently in Denver or any massive city. The reason I say Denver specifically is that there will be a team there by 2026, but currently there is nothing. Um, and yeah, so that is the national side of the soccer coverage in the United States. And as we see, even though the coverage is kind of different, the MLS still gets a higher coverage of attention from the media than the women's side, and then that leads to a lack of visibility for women's athletes, or female identifying athletes, and that can kind of create a block for people that are trying to go pro and for youth athletes. Like if they don't see themselves being represented on a national level or an international level, they're not going to feel confident that they can get there as well. So moving on to the international side of things, I mentioned him before, but Cristiano Ronaldo has 1 billion followers across all of his social media platforms. He is the most followed athlete in the world. Lionel Messi has, like I said before, 505 million on Instagram. Um, Salah has 64 million, and Neymar has 227 million followers on Instagram, respectively. All four of these players are considered to be the top four names right now internationally in the world. So Ronaldo plays for Portugal, Messi plays for Argentina, Salah plays for Egypt, and Neymar plays for Brazil. In their career, Ronaldo has 135 goals, Messi has 112 goals, Salah has 57 goals, and Neymar has 79 for a total of 383. Now, what's interesting about this is those names I just said, you're probably very familiar with them because they're the big names that you hear about all the time. They're like the big two especially are Ronaldo and Messi, and they have been for so many years because they both went pro so young. So they get a lot of media attention and a lot of media coverage, and we see that because of how many followers they have across their social media platforms. But where you start to see a little bit of a gap and where you start to see why we need more coverage for the women's side is Alex Morgan, who plays for the US, has 16 million followers across Instagram and Facebook. Christine Sinclair, who is a Canadian, has 111,000 followers on Instagram. Megan Rapinoe, who also plays for the US, has 2 million followers on Instagram. And Putellas has 3 million followers on Instagram as well. So she is a Spanish player. But here's where it starts to get interesting. You can see that there's a massive gap between how many followers all of these athletes have. Where it gets interesting is this. So Morgan has or had at the end of her career, because she has since retired, 123 goals for the US, which is almost right up there with the total for Ronaldo. She has more than Messi, she has more than Neymar, and way more than Salah, okay? This is where it also gets really interesting. Megan Rapinoe, at the end of her career, because she also retired, has 63 goals. Putellas is a up and coming Spanish star, so she doesn't have that many goals yet. She has 12. But the number one scorer in the world is actually Christine Sinclair across men's and women's competitions altogether. She has a total of 190 goals compared to Ronaldo's 135. Yet, I don't know how many of you listening to this even know who she is compared to how many of you probably know who Ronaldo is. He gets a lot of coverage. He's considered to be the best scorer of all time. He has the most amount of goals of all time, and that's not actually true. He has the most amount of goals all time on the men's side. Overall, in the entire history of soccer, Christine Sinclair has been beat by over 60 goals. And that is a very important fact to remember. To put it into perspective as well, um, the total amount of goals between the women's players are 388. The men's total goals is 383. So out of those four only, compared to the amount of followers they have, while the men have a much higher following across social media, the women have been more successful in terms of scoring goals. And actually, if you add together the total amount that Alex Morgan has and Putellas, since she is just starting, you equal 135 goals, which is how much Cristiano Ronaldo has scored across the entirety of his career. So even though Christine Sinclair has almost half of the total of all men's top scorers, she is lesser known due to the lack of our media coverage on international women's players outside of the US women's national team. So when it comes to the international stage, she is very well known in Canada. Like she is, a big celebrity there. Um, but again, like she doesn't have a huge following. She herself, her total amount of goals is half of the whole men's total goals combined. Um, but again, she has Ronaldo and Messi beat by a large amount of goals, and she's not given the same amount of respect and attention by the media simply because, as a whole, the Canadians women's national team has not been as successful in competitions as, Ronaldo and Messi on their own, respectively. Obviously, we know that the U.S. women's national team has been very dominant for a long time when it comes to soccer. And Christine Sinclair did come up and, she had been a player for a very long time at the same time that the women's side for the U.S. was starting to really kick off and really get good. And so, because of that, she unfortunately didn't have a chance to win as many championships, win as many gold medals as maybe people felt that she should have, myself included. And if you are a women's soccer fan, then you know exactly what her story is and how much respect she deserves for her illustrious career in terms of scoring goals and breaking records. Unfortunately, though, like I said, she's not given as much coverage. Yet, I think it's important to recognize her for her achievements, especially considering, like I said, she deserves that title of the top scorer in the world because she is. If you look at the stats, she has a large amount of goals higher than Ronaldo. And that's unfortunate that you spent so long on a career but the media doesn't recognize you for it. And it's things like that which is the whole reason why this podcast episode for me is very important because you need to have high representation for women's sports because this woman should not have had her career only judged by the fact that she didn't really win that many championships. Like she has so many individual achievements that she needs to be recognized for. Yet we don't really do that in the US because, she's not a US citizen. She doesn't play for the US. She played for Canada. So we don't really recognize her success as much, which is very sad to see. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of the soccer side of it. And then the next sport that I'm going to move into is basketball, where I will be comparing the NBA, the WNBA, and then the NCAA March Madness tournaments on both the women's and the men's sides. So moving on to the next major sport that I'm going to be discussing for this podcast. After soccer, I thought one of the important sports to bring to the forefront would be the sport of basketball, especially because March Madness has just happened. Actually, when I was collecting the data for this podcast episode and creating my notes that I was going to be using, the tournament was in full effect. And so I think this year you finally saw a lot of progress in terms of higher viewership rates for the women's tournament, higher media coverage for the women's tournament. So we can kind of start to see that basketball is kind of attempting to do what soccer did and trying to bring more media coverage and media attention on female athletes just in general, but specifically with basketball, because there has long been pay discrepancies between NBA, WNBA players. There was a whole controversy last year with the March Madness tournament in terms of how women weren't receiving as many partnership deals and the men were receiving almost all of them. And for those of you that remember, a few years back, I think around the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, I believe this was in 2021, there was the whole weight room issue that the women's side had not received nearly as much equipment and enough funding from the NCAA committee in terms of being able to be given the same equipment in the weight rooms. They were literally given like a single stack of dumbbell weights, whereas the men were given like a state of the art gigantic gym that was built just for the men's tournament, and then all of that equipment would be relocated somewhere else, and they only gave the women like a single corner compared to the gigantic room that they gave the men to train, and that became a huge controversy. And through the use of social media and the outrage that the public had, seeing that there is this huge discrepancy, there was changes made so that the women would eventually get the same weight room. However, as a whole, as we can see, the fact that that was even a potential that they thought that that was even acceptable to do really showcases that there is still a huge gap between the importance that executives put on women's sports versus men's sports. So I'm going to begin by going into a little bit of a comparison between the NBA and the WNBA before I really go into the NCAA tournament and the discrepancies that exist there. Because even though college basketball as a whole does tend to have a lot of high viewership rates, the NBA and the WNBA are obviously the professional leagues. And so a lot of players do eventually go on to these leagues that want to go pro. So starting off with the NBA, there are currently 30 teams in the league, 29 play in the US and only one play in Canada. The total social media following of all of the teams in the NBA equate to 101.3 million, and the actual NBA account itself has about 89.8 million followers. The four big names that I will be focusing on for the comparison of the players for this podcast are Steph Curry, LeBron James, Michael Jordan, and Kevin Durant. So starting off with Steph Curry, he currently has 58 million followers on Instagram. LeBron James has 159 million followers on Instagram. Kevin Durant has 13.7 million followers on Instagram. And what's interesting here is Michael Jordan, even though he is such a big name in the realm of basketball, he has no social media accounts that he himself runs. Any social media account that exists related to Michael Jordan is a fan account. But between the three players that I named that do have social media accounts, their combined following equates to about 230.7 million followers, which is much higher than the combined following for all of the NBA teams. So even though, yes, there is a huge following for the NBA, the players themselves tend to have a huge following compared to the league. It's like accounts and the team accounts itself, which is a little bit different than soccer, where the teams have the international teams themselves have usually more followers than the players, but here we see the opposite. So some stats from the last season of the NBA: LeBron James had fourth for all assists, and Steph Curry had third ranking when it came to three-pointers. But besides that, those four big names, that was the only big stat that really stood out. And their games do primarily air on national television on either ABC or ESPN, and they do also stream games on YouTube TV. And that's important because I'm going to come back to that in a second. So, moving on to the WNBA, there are currently 13 teams that are all in the US. Their total social media following of all of their teams is less than 4 million. None of the teams' accounts exceed 650,000 followers. The WNBA account itself does have 3.1 million, which is interesting because the account for the league has almost the same amount as the total combined following for all of the teams within that league. The four big names that I will be focusing on for this comparison are Brianna Stewart or Stewie, Caitlin Clark, Kelsey Plum, and Aja Wilson. So first of all, Brianna Stewart has 461,000 followers on Instagram. Caitlin Clark has 3.1 million followers on Instagram, which is exactly the same amount as the actual WNBA account. Kelsey Plum has 1.2 million followers, and Aja Wilson has 1.3 million. So combined, they have 6.06 million followers, which doubles the total followers of all of the teams in the WNBA account itself. So again, we see something kind of similar here to how the media treats and how the public treats the NBA players. The same thing goes for the WNBA players. Like they, by themselves, the players are way more popular than the league itself or the teams. And that's an interesting thing because I feel like with a lot of other sports that you see, like NFL, MLB, there are some big names, but at the end of the day, the teams are usually known more than the players that play for those teams. And, to see it kind of be the opposite here is definitely a little bit of an interesting statistic to look at. When it came to stats for this last season, Brianna Stewart was all over the leaderboard. She led in rebounds, blocks, fantasy points, was third in assists and free throws made, and was fifth in terms of fantasy points per game on average. Aja Wilson did lead the league in points per game, blocks per game. She was second in rebounds per game, fifth in steals per game, and she did lead in fantasy points per game. Caitlin Clark led in assists per game, 3 pointers made, and was third in terms of fantasy points per game. And lastly, Kelsey Plum was third in 3 pointers made. So compared to the men, the women here that are the big names were greatly more successful on the court um, than the male players, by the sounds of it that I listed. Even though the male players ended up having a higher Instagram following, a higher social media following. They probably are getting the higher brand deals. They are probably getting, the most amount of media attention, but yet their stats don't equate to their following. Whereas the women's side, their stats should like shoot them up to a higher media coverage, a higher media attention. And outside of Caitlin Clark and Brianna Stewart, Kelsey Plum and Aja Wilson have also been receiving a huge bit of the spotlight. But I would say, arguably, right now, Caitlin Clark and Brianna Stewart are probably your top two players in terms of the media coverage they're getting. But they can't do it by themselves. There needs to be more media attention, more media coverage, more brand deals coming for the women because they are just as important. Um, and yeah, so I think that this really showcases that the women are fairly more dominant on the court than the men are, but they don't receive as much media attention simply because they are women. And the WNBA, lastly, compared to the NBA, does also primarily air on several different channels in terms of national TV coverage. They air on ABC, ESPN, NBC, Amazon Prime, and CBS, but only in Canada. And so what we see here is even though the WNBA has branched out more into national TV, they have a lot of different avenues that they stream on compared to the men's side. And that kind of makes it a little bit more complicated because it's harder to figure out which channel the game is going to be on. Whereas for the NBA, you can pretty much guarantee that any game is going to be on ABC or ESPN that's local or regional. And then if it's not, then you can stream on YouTube TV. And it's a little bit more simple to find games that way. So now I'm going to go into the NCAA tournament, specifically the March Madness tournament, because that is when a lot of the country is focusing on basketball. So for years, there have been obvious discrepancies between the attention that both the men's and women's March Madness tournament receives. When you Google March Madness, if you choose to, the first 7 articles that you will find are all related to the men's tournament. In order to get hits for women's tournaments, you do need to specifically search for the women's March Madness tournament. You cannot just type in March Madness alone. All of the men's games for March Madness are on network TV and are large arenas or stadiums across the country. Meanwhile, the women's side this past year did not have an airing schedule when I created this list of notes, but did end up also airing on network TV. But they were only relegated to the same three stadiums or arenas, whereas the men were playing all across the country. The amount of funding is scarce for the women in comparison for the men. So this past year, the women received $65 million in revenue for the total amount of their NCAA tournament, but the men's as a whole received $1 billion. And that difference in revenue led to the discrepancies in the amount of money that the NCAA regulated to each of the sides when it came to the tournament this past year. This was also the first tournament in 2025 where the women were paid. The men had been paid since the tournament started, and this was the first time the women actually were receiving a paycheck for putting their careers on hold a little bit, also putting their college careers on hold. Because let's face it, if you're not, going to school in those three stadiums or arenas or in those same areas as the only three places that you could potentially play, as a woman, you do have to do a lot of traveling. You're probably doing a lot of your homework and your schoolwork and your classwork like online because you can't go to class. So it's like you're putting, for some of them, the last semester of college on hold to go and play for this tournament. So it makes sense that you should be compensated for that. And it's kind of crazy to think that, you know, this is the first tournament that the women will be paid. And part of the reason for that is because of the NIL deal that was signed a few years ago, which stands for name, image, likeness. And that allows the players to make more money than they would be receiving for the NCAA tournament in order to create brand deals for themselves and to make a name for themselves in the world of marketing. Like I said before, there was that 2021 controversy over the equipment that did come out, and it was obvious that the league had given most of the budget for spending to the men. And this really showcased that sexism still exists within the NCAA in regard to female and male teams. And finally, this year was the first time that trans women were not allowed to play in the tournament, but nothing was ever released regarding trans men. And this was due to President Trump's administrative executive orders that were released leading up to the tournament, saying that if you were a trans woman, you were not allowed to compete in sports. But again, we see this discrepancy where the trans women are being forced to not play a sport, but trans men are not deemed as having that same threat, I guess, to biological females or biological males. And it's interesting because this is a debate that has gone on for a long time in regard to trans athletes and where they should be allowed to compete. Do they compete for their sex that was assigned at birth, or do they compete as the gender that they chose to identify with as they got older? And this is something that I don't know if we're ever going to really see a resolve to. But it's interesting that, again, you're seeing that trans women are being told that they can't play, but trans men are being told that they can. And part of that could just be because there are more trans women that are publicly outspoken about the fact that they are trans, and there might be some trans men out there that the world doesn't actually know if they are trans or not because they haven't publicly disclosed that for fear maybe of that discrimination that they would receive. But again, we see that there's a discrepancy here where if you're a woman, you're being told, you know, your worth is not as high or you are not allowed to compete in the sport that you want to simply because you used to be a different gender. And it's a conversation that will probably continue. We've talked about a lot in this class in terms of current events that I've seen posted throughout the weeks. And it is now, impacting sports in a whole nother way than we thought was even possible. And that kind of just summarizes the state of basketball right now. There have been switches, there have been changes to give women more marketing opportunities. Like I said, this past year was when the women were originally being paid, and it's kind of crazy to think that they weren't paid beforehand. But hopefully, that's a sign that we're moving in a positive direction in terms of giving women more marketing and brand deals. And I know for sure when I was watching the tournaments, there was definitely a lot more advertisements and commercials featuring female athletes that were in the tournament rather than just men. And that is also because of the NIL deal that was signed a few years ago. So after basketball, the next sport that I want to really focus on is tennis. This is an interesting one because tennis is a very individualized sport. The other sports I've talked about thus far have all been team sports, and there's a lot of moving pieces with that. But when it comes to the individual side, you're kind of left to really fend for yourself when it comes to a paycheck, getting, media coverage, interviewing with different networks and, websites and things like that. You're all doing it by yourself. Um, so full disclosure here, I do not know as much about tennis as I do about soccer and basketball. So I kind of just, gathered some things that I have picked up from other classes that I have taken. I am currently taking a class this semester called Gender, Race, and Sexuality in U.S. Sports. And this was a topic specifically that we had dived into with tennis, like the differences between how the media treats men's and women's tennis players and tennis players of color. And I'm going to get into that throughout this conversation. So starting off on the men's side, Rafael Nadal has 21 million followers on Instagram. He did retire in 2024, but when he was playing, he played for Spain. We also have Federer, who had 13 million followers and is Swiss. Djorkovic, who is 15.7 million followers and is Serbian, and Alcaraz, has 6 million followers and also plays for Spain. So in total, the top four men's players in the world, as of 2024, had 55.7 million followers across all social media platforms. When it comes to the women's side, the two most notable ones are the Williams sisters. This is kind of interesting here. Serena Williams has 18 million followers on Instagram, while her sister Venus has 2.04 million followers. And also Coco Gauff, who also plays for the US because the Williams sisters are American. She also has about 2 million followers on Instagram. And lastly, Kornikova, who plays for Russia, has 2 million followers. So all of the women's players combined that I just named have about 24.04 million, which is about half of the following for the men's side. But yet, I think when people think of tennis, one of the first players that comes to mind is Serena Williams. And I think that there's a reason that her follower count is much, much higher than the other women that I just named. So while some of the best tennis players on the men's side tend to come from European countries, the women's side has long been dominated by the Americans. Due to the difference in media coverage, many of the women's players for the American side that are women of color face discrimination for both their gender and racial identities because they face intersectionality. And it's interesting because this was something that Serena and Venus Williams were very, very public about when they were playing. They received a lot of difference in their media coverage and a lot of the media attention just simply because of their race. And I think it doesn't take that long to find if you just do a Google search for Serena Williams racism. There's going to be a lot of hits that pop up because unfortunately she did receive some very brutal and disgusting comments simply because she was a black woman playing tennis for the US. And that is all that there was to be said about that. And it's very sad to see because as a whole, athletes of color do face racial discrimination because they are being put on a higher stage in regard to media attention. But it's very sad to see that the extent to which these comments go is very much simply for with the Williams sisters, their gender and their race. It's very much because they are a woman and that they are a woman of color. That is why they are facing the discrimination that they face. Um, Part of the reason for this is actually because tennis as a whole has long been referred to as a country club sport, which is, because you need to spend a lot of money to get the equipment. It's a sport that you can't just pick up randomly. You need to be trained in it to compete well. And because of that, many have preconceived notions that tennis is a sport that is reserved for white athletes rather than women of color. And because of that, that is one of the reasons why they face such high rates of racial discrimination compared to other athletes of color. So, an example of this is, basketball has historically been looked at as a sport for Black or African American people. And because of that, if you are a Black athlete playing for an NBA or a WNBA team, you will still face most likely racial discrimination because unfortunately it's just part of the sports culture. There tends to be very racist notions there. But as a whole, they probably aren't receiving as much discrimination as Serena Williams was when she was playing tennis because they were considered to be playing a sport that was fit for their race. And that's not my personal opinion. That's just an opinion I read once in an article for a different class. But there is a preconceived notion that certain sports are reserved for certain races. And if you break out of that, that's when people start to have an issue. There have also been many examples of how women of color are treated differently by refs and umpires at the matches that they play in. So if you Google a video, I forget who she was playing, but there was a match where Serena Williams was penalized by losing a point on something that an opponent who was white would have only received a warning for. And there are videos that dive into the mentality of the ref or the ump when this call was being made, but it's the fact that it's even easy to find these videos and spot that the refs are holding their own racist preconceived notions related to the sport is very sad to see. Um, as a whole, tennis is not really shown on TV except for the Olympics. It does tend to be on channels that are not well known for broadcasting sports. Like I think I've seen tennis matches broadcasted on like TNT or TBS, which I don't know about you guys, but I usually, when I am scrolling through the TV channels, those channels tend to also have a lot of sitcom shows like The Big Bang Theory, Everybody Loves Raymond, Friends. Like that tends to be where a lot of those air. And so to see that that is the platform that is being used for tennis is very interesting. And as a whole, there's not a lot of media coverage on the sport of tennis. It's considered to be an underrated sport compared to other sports like soccer and basketball. And part of this is because, it's not always being televised. There are a lot of competitions that happen. There's the big ones like the US Open, the Australian Open, Wimbledon. Like there's a whole bunch of big name tennis um, matches that are usually aired on a lot of national TV channels, and that one is easy to find. But if it's not a big sport competition like that where there's a medal or there's a trophy on the line, most of the time the media is not focusing that heavily on it. Lastly, tennis is always an international sport because there is no domestic league within the US. And because of that, training is very individualized for the athlete, which makes sponsorship and advertising very important in order to pay bills or in order to continue to play the sport that they love. So if you're not receiving that amount of media coverage, if you're not getting those marketing deals, unfortunately, it can be very hard for you to afford to stay in that sport because, like I said, it's very individualized. The women's national team for soccer, for example, U.S. Soccer Federation pays for their equipment, pays for their fields, pays for their training. The NBA the teams themselves pay for the training for the players. The players aren't paying out of pocket for that. But here, you do kind of have to pay out of pocket. And so tennis is a little bit of a unique sport compared to the other ones that I'm going to be discussing just because again, it's not a team sport. It's a very individualized sport. I mean, if you play doubles, that's a little bit different, but also you're competing with a person, but you're also competing against that person to get a higher media deal. Because a lot of the money that they get paid if they don't win comes from media deals or marketing deals. And so tennis is a bit of a unique sport to this situation, but again, we see that there is a higher lack of coverage for the women's side than the men's side. And as a whole, women of color do tend to face higher rates of racial discrimination for playing tennis than men who play tennis and are men of color. So that's definitely a little bit of a unique situation for that sport specifically. So the last sport that I'm going to go very in depth into is a comparison between both baseball and softball, since even though they are slightly different sports, they are essentially considered to be the male and female versions of the same sport. And there has been a big push, even up until last week, with getting professional softball leagues off of the ground. Um, but I'll do the men's side first because there's just a few fast facts that I think are important to kind of like put out there in terms of like why there has been such a discrepancy between why the MLB is always being promoted so much more by the media than any version of a softball league that has attempted to be founded and why those leagues have been unsuccessful. This sport really kind of encapsulates why the lack of media attention, the lack of media coverage for both male and female athletes, and that difference between male and female athletes with the media coverage they receive, why that is such a big issue and how it can, affect the athletes that play those sports. So the MLB currently has 30 teams, 29 are in the US, one is in Canada. It was founded in 1903, and because of this, is considered to be one of the oldest sports leagues in the United States. It is actually the oldest professional sports league in the entirety of the US, but it is kind of grouped in with like the NFL, the NHL, those big leagues, in terms of being considered older sports, even though this was the first official sports league, professional sports league, I should say, developed within the US. The MLB League account on Instagram has about 12.1 million followers, and the total amount of followers across all of their team accounts equate to about 39.088 million. which does change based on the team. The most followed team is the Dodgers, and the least followed team is the Marlins. The MLB is broadcast on national TV. It does change based on location most of the time, with local stations broadcasting the game that most closely corresponds to you based on where you currently are in the US or Canada. But there are national broadcasts as well for, big games that get a lot of media attention and get a lot of press attention from, just the history of those rivalries. So an example of that would be like the Subway Series with the Yankees and the Mets. Since they both are New York-based teams, even though yes, New York will always get the Yankees and the Mets games, the rest of the country will also get a lot of coverage for that specific series because it is such a big rivalry and it means so much to the game in terms of being able to get followers, being able to get media coverage. It's like one of those big sports rivalries that has existed for so long that everybody knows that anytime that they play, it's going to be a good game. Um, the World Series, which the name for the championship is debatable because it is not necessarily including the world. It is literally only including the US and Canada. It is aired in prime time on mainstream TV channels, and there are also multiple streaming options for those that want to watch it but live in other spots across the world. Um, so all in all, the MLB has a ton of media coverage. It is considered to be one of the oldest sports in the US. It has a huge following. It always has. It's broken a lot of barriers, including Jackie Robinson with the color barrier. And I think that, there is something to be said for the amount of history that exists with this team. But because as a whole, we as a public assume that baseball is going to have a larger following than softball, it has been very hard to actually get a professional softball league developed and off the ground. So there have been three now attempts at trying to get a professional softball league, established within the US. Two are in the past. One is going to be established this year. The first version of a softball professional league was called National Pro Fast Pitch. It was founded in 2004, which is important to note because that was over 100 years after the founding of Major League Baseball. Again, this league doesn't exist anymore. And before it was called that, it was also known as Women's Professional Softball, or WPS. Women's Professional Fast Pitch is a current league that has a small following, but it is an example of a professional softball league. So the account itself has about 34,000 followers. It was founded in October of 2021, and their first season was held in 2022. And the reason why this is kind of like a version of an established league, but not 100%, is because there's only four teams in the league and all of them play in Texas. So it's literally just like the state of Texas has a professional softball league. Um, and if you are trying to play softball and you don't live in Texas, unfortunately, you might have to move, and there might be some changes with that. Um, but because there has been such a push in the last, 5 years or so to really try to get another version of women's professional softball and national pro fast pitch kind of off the ground, the Athletes Unlimited Softball League, or the AUSL, is set to debut this year and will have a total of four teams that will consist of a 24 game format, meaning that each team will play each other about 8 times throughout the duration of the season. And the whole season will happen over the course of 4 weeks. And one of the reasons why a lot of people are very excited about this is that Nike is the main partner and the main sponsor of this league. So seeing a big corporation like Nike that has always had a large stake in the sports world, seeing them start to get in on creating this professional league makes people really hopeful that, you know, this could potentially be a league that sticks around for at least the foreseeable future. Unfortunately, it's a little unknown right now how exactly they're going to stream these games, but the fact that there is a talk to create another version of a professional softball league and that they have such a big corporate sponsor backing them is really showcasing how we are starting to see the shift towards giving that more media coverage over towards the women's side of the game. This is kind of similar to what the women's professional soccer league, like the NWSL has now been in existence for about a little over 10 years. But before that, it was went through several other variations, as I previously talked about when I focused on the soccer section. It wasn't just we have the NWSL and this is the league. It went through several variations as well, and time again, we see whereas females are able to, you know, push and really have to, advocate for themselves to get that same amount of media coverage. They're also being given a disadvantage of not being able to be having this type of platform, not having this type of sports league to go professional in the first place. And when they try to establish some version of a professional league, it does end up not getting as much media coverage or media support. And that's ultimately what leads to them, not wanting to move forward because sponsorships are going to go out the window if you don't have anyone watching your game. And this is why so many male athletes and male dominated sports leagues get a huge amount of funding because these corporations think that they're more able to be, profited off of. And I mean, the stats unfortunately kind of showcase that if you are trying to put stake into a team, then you are more likely to go with a team in a league that has already been established. But unfortunately, there is another side to it, which is that these women that are trying to push for this professional sports league get, hit down time and time again. And it's just literally because they're women. And this just really showcases how big this gender gap exists in sports when it comes to media representation and media coverage. If the only reason your league is not able to be successful is because you're not getting that media coverage, then something needs to change because there's no excuse for why you are not being given that same amount of media attention that you should be receiving just because you are a woman. But overall, softball has not been given as large of a platform as Major League Baseball. It does tend to have a lot of following when the Olympics come because the softball games at the Olympic tournament do tend to draw a lot of viewership. But there has been growing interest, which is why, we are trying again and we are going to have another attempt at a professional softball league. The large amount of changes to the professional level include changes to the names of leagues, and thereby players and coaches have made it very difficult to get traction for publicity. Because, changing the name of the league means people don't know exactly what you're talking about. And so without that consistency, again, it's very hard to get traction when it comes to media coverage and media attention. But like I said before, partnering with Nike could be a step in the right direction for finally getting an equal amount of publicity for a professional softball league. Although obviously it's going to most likely take a while to even get close to reaching the MLB status, just given the league's large history within the United States and just within the sports world in general. So lastly, how does this all connect to the overall topic that I had set out to accomplish when I decided to gather all of these facts and data for this podcast? How does this relate back to our class? And most importantly, what do these discrepancies between the way that male and female athletes are treated and male and female sports teams are treated by the media ultimately have an impact on youth athletes or those that are competing in youth sports? So, to start off with tying everything together, the reason I had so many different data points is I wanted to showcase greatly how big the gap really is in terms of the following differences between male and female athletes in the same sport. So I took, a good amount of very popular sports in the entire world, some predominantly in the US, but looking at international facts, looking at national facts, and comparing those as well, because this is not just a US based issue, this is a world based issue. And part of that has to do with the fact that sports used to be considered something that men could only compete in, going back to even like ancient Greece and ancient Rome, women were forbidden from competing in sports and they were not allowed to be athletes. They had to sit there, they had to watch the men play, they had to support the men. And, there is in some cultures this continuous stigma associated with being an athlete where if you are a female athlete, you're automatically considered to be inferior than just simply because you are female or you are female identifying. And because of that, male sports and male athletes tend to be put up on a higher pedestal and tend to be given much more coverage, sponsorships, attention, just simply from the fact that they are men and that they're not women. And it's important to realize that if Cristiano Ronaldo was not a male, he would probably not be getting as high of recognition as he currently has from the world because realistically, as I said for soccer, Christine Sinclair from Canada has a much higher record and has a much better stat line for her career than Ronaldo, yet most people don't know who she is, and everybody pretty much knows who Cristiano Ronaldo is. And that is a prime example there of how the media coverage can really sway our perceptions of male and female athletes and male and females in sports. Because of that, with these large followings, the media is going to follow where the public follows, right? So they're going to give that more media attention and that more of that spotlight towards someone that has a higher social media following than someone that is just kind of starting out. There are some smaller, media companies, some smaller magazines or newspapers or things like that, where they might try to entice their viewers for, showcasing an up and comer, someone that they think might be like the next big thing, stuff like that. And while that is true for some, that's not the case for all. And unfortunately, unless you are recognized on the international level, you don't really get a lot of media attention as a female athlete. And while that is changing and that narrative is changing, that does not ultimately have a high enough effect on whether or not it has an impact on youth athletes. And as I was saying in the intro to this podcast episode, you know, if youth sports and youth athletes competing in youth sports teams, if they don't have those types of role models, if they don't see themselves being represented, then they're not going to be able to compete confidently, feeling like they are working towards something that's achievable. And that's very disheartening. And there's a reason why so many women and so many young girls drop out of sports before they get to the high school or college level, or even before they go pro. And part of that has to do with the fact that they know that they're not going to be paid as much money. They're not going to be receiving, as many equal benefits. They're not going to be given that equal media attention. You're taking a risk going into a sport where your future is pretty uncertain compared to somebody else that is playing in a sports league like the MLB or the NFL that have been in the media sphere for over 100 years now and have had that long running history of so many millions of fans really rooting for teams and players within this league just simply because they take pride in playing in a league that has had such a big history. And that's not to say that, some women don't want to make history. Some women do want to be in those sports leagues where they're pushing for change. They want, social justice, and they are bringing these issues to the forefront. It's just sometimes the change is not happening fast enough to compensate for the lack of continuation for women and girls in sports. And, this has been an ongoing issue, dilemma, whatever word you want to use for it, for a very long time. And it's quite sad to see. And, I think society has a large role to play in this, and that's because, there is kind of almost this assumption that if you're a female athlete, you're going to have a harder career, which is very true from either the media perspective, from the fan perspective, from the league perspective. You have to work twice as hard to get the respect. And that's a white woman. That's not even a woman of color or a trans woman or a non binary woman. Like, there is a whole multitude of identities you can hold that will prevent you from having success if you go pro. And that's why some people aren't willing to take that risk. They're not willing to risk their entire life savings or their entire you know, paycheck just simply because they want to potentially make history. That's not guaranteed. And so, if we don't encourage women and girls to continue in sports, then we're not going to see these changes happen as fast as we need them to. And that is where it gets a little tricky with youth sports and youth athletes because they don't see themselves being represented. They don't have a role model, and very few of them are willing to take on that responsibility of being a role model. And because that's asking a lot. You're expected your first season, your rookie season, to be this amazing person, and then you're held up to that standard. And we've seen time and time again when that happens, serious injuries can unfold, and because of the amount of stress that they are putting on their bodies, not just physically, but also mentally and emotionally, because now they have this added pressure of being this inspiration that so many young girls are looking up to. And if you don't maintain a certain status in society, then those girls are not going to look up to you anymore and you lose their respect, you lose their inspiration. So that is something that is very unique to women and girls in sports. Um, and because of this, that is why I wanted to do this podcast episode, was to just kind of draw some more attention to why there are these big discrepancies between male and female athletes, where we tend to see the biggest discrepancies, and most importantly, why these discrepancies are so damaging for youth athletes and youth sports. Because again, specifically with young girls, we're starting to see a shift where once you hit middle school, the numbers significantly drop compared to the amount of male athletes that continue onwards into high school, into college, into the professional leagues. And because of that, again, that is part of the reason why female leagues and female sports just in general have had a hard time getting off the ground because there's not enough retention of players to fuel these leagues. And I figure that this relates to the class because, ultimately pop culture does play a huge role in sports and which athletes are being given that most media attention. Because, again, like I said, the media is going to follow the athletes or the sports that the public and society tends to favor. Because that's who everybody's talking about. That's who everybody wants to have a, huge media deal with. And that is something that ultimately does favor male athletes. And, we have seen kind of a shift, especially in the last 10 years more so, with female athletes continuing to get higher recognition from the public. But again, this ties back to some of the tropes and themes that we have seen throughout this class, where ultimately sports can be sexist, sports can be racist. There are these underlying structures that we see in society being brought into sports and other facets of life. So there's always a hierarchy where, again, a white male athlete is going to make significantly more than a black female athlete just simply because he is white and he is a male. So we see these themes of privilege, these themes of intersectionality also very much affecting whether an athlete is successful or not. And that goes back to how gender is represented in our society and how gender is portrayed in pop culture. And because of that, I wanted to really take the time to go in depth on these sports because this is something that I am very passionate about. And I hope that this is the last time that we see these dramatic changes and these large discrepancies between male and female athletes with their social media following as well as the amount of media coverage that they are receiving. I am hopeful for the future. I just do not know how close we are going to be able to close that gap um, in my lifetime. And I really wish that it was a simpler solution than a complicated answer. But there are some women out there who are willing to step up and take on that responsibility so that the sports world is much, much better by the time that they retire. And if they go off into coaching, that they can also then continue to inspire. And hopefully, we have more female sports leagues that continue to stick around and that continue to make an impact so that on ESPN's homepage, it's not just male dominated sports. There's female sports and male sports being displayed everywhere, and that on major news stations, female sports and female athletes aren't being thrown to the wayside just because a male athlete or a male sports team had something that was considered to be more profitable or more viewer based in terms of media coverage. So, because of this, I just want to say thank you for listening to this podcast episode. I really enjoyed this Genius Hour project. I very much enjoyed doing the research, collecting all the stats and the data, and trying to kind of encapsulate what I feel is a very important aspect of our popular culture. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.